We were live.
Right, we are reconvening our morning meeting and picking up discussion of S 127. I mean, we have 120s in our heads right now, 127, the housing bill, which is not in our possession, but we've been asked to consider areas of our jurisdiction that are in the bill as drafted. And after we got the introduction the other day and heard from John Groveman, took the liberty of asking John Gray to draft an amendment that would limit the scope of the proposed chips.
Chip, no S, but
No S.
but it's all.
It's 70s TV show, I think I'm referring to. You wouldn't know. At any rate, chip program to tier 1A and 1B only. And then also, I'm not sure if you had time to consider some language that would limit public investments through the chip program to primary residents. So with that.
Good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm happy to dive into that proposed amendment, or if you would like to see what House Commerce proposed, I'm happy to, or we can do both, just whatever the.
We have time for both, but let's start with ours,
which is, yes, so I will screen share. Stretch it a little bit. Just for orientation purposes, the way that this looks is not like a bill, right? This is just language that we're addressing separately, similar to what House Commerce was doing. I just had this chip specific language and it would be dropped into S127. So what you see here is the underlying text is drawn from House Commerce's chip proposal. And then I have two tweaks related to these requests, and I can jump to those. So the first of these is related to the primary residence piece. And that is, we can start at the bottom of page 5. And you'll actually see the highlighted text on the following page, but I think it's helpful to see the section as a whole. So we're talking about here the housing infrastructure agreement, which is the agreement that has to be in place between the municipality, the developer, and potentially a third-party sponsor. And this governs their relationship, and it does certain minimal things to ensure that you have some safeguards in place, but otherwise it leaves these parties to negotiate the way that they pursue this project, subject to all the other restrictions of the subchapter. But this is the agreement that would happen between the developer and the municipality governing this project. So first things you see at the bottom of that page, the housing infrastructure agreement shall clearly identify the sponsor, so who's financing it, clearly identify the developer and the housing development. So what is the output of this, even beyond the infrastructural improvements? Because just to remind you guys, what's being financed with tax increment is just the improvements, just the infrastructure. And the idea is that this reduces costs sufficiently, that a housing development that is specified in this agreement will be produced, but you're not financing outright the housing development, you're financing the infrastructural improvements. So this agreement would identify who's financing it, would identify who's developing, and what that housing development is. More substantively, on the top of page 6, it requires, and this is one of the safeguarding measures for the municipality, that you obligate the tax increments or not more than the financing and related costs for the housing infrastructure project. What this language is meant to get at is ensuring that a muni doesn't, through its contractual negotiation, obligate the voters of the town essentially for more than they would provide. This is saying you can only provide those tax increments to cover financing that's approved under this program and related costs approved under this program. You can't start funneling money out to a developer through this scheme. That's what this sub 3 is trying to get at. The request, as described by the chair for primary residences, the attempt is here on line 4, subdivision 4, provide terms to ensure that any housing unit within the housing development be offered exclusively as a primary residence in perpetuity. So this is a general prescription for what would need to be done in this agreement. It doesn't say how you achieve this, right? It says provide terms to ensure that this is the case. What we've talked about, because this idea has come up on a time limited duration, the House Commerce version has a concept like this, but it is time limited to just the duration of the financing. So if that's 30 years, this would expire at the end of that 30-year term. This is an in perpetuity requirement, but as discussed in that committee, what we've talked about is that basically this would be, one natural path of doing this might be that the developer has to build in covenants so that when they sell these properties, it can only be offered on this basis. And so that's what the thinking is here. It is not prescriptive as to how folks achieve this, but it's saying that contractually you need to build this out to ensure that these are only offered as primary residences. Part of why this was considered in this section as opposed to in, say, the application section, right, is that this is building it into contractual terms. And from a monitoring standpoint, there was some concern that if you include this in the application process, maybe VEPC isn't equipped or isn't going to be regularly going out and checking things. So this actually builds it into a contract that would not require VEPC to do this monitoring. Now, it is to still say that the effect of this will depend on what folks do in the field, and it doesn't ensure that there is some kind of monitoring that happens on this basis. But if you've built them as contractual terms, then someone who's violating that right, you could seek remedies under the contract. So that is the thinking behind both why it is included in this section and why it is not entirely prescriptive as to how someone might achieve this. And the thinking here is that the folks negotiating as to how they do this housing development and how they do these projects is likely in a better position to understand the mechanisms for ensuring that this is the place. But you could, that's to say, tighten up what provide terms means. And just to call out, in House General this morning, we talked about this phrase, but in the time limited one, so not you guys' proposal, which is in perpetuity, there is a suggestion to potentially include provide terms and remedies to ensure that any housing unit, I think that those would necessarily be in place, but just to make more clear that folks need to have the option of seeking something if folks are in violation of whatever those terms might be. I will pause there if that's. But this is the measure to try to get at primary residences. And just to call out, we talked last time about section 1907, which is the purpose section of this subchapter. As you received it from the Senate, it speaks to stimulating the development of primary residences for low to moderate income. But when I was in here, we talked about how kind of the extent of how the draft spoke to that concern, and there weren't substantive measures beyond that purpose to achieve it. This is a much more substantive measure to achieve that particular outcome. And there's some other pieces I could talk to that won't be highlighted in this draft that try to get at some of those same concerns and just might be helpful to see.
And interest in the low to moderate income, if there's any bounds on that in here, anything that's beyond the purpose section.
Yes, and one thing that's worth noting there, and this did come up this morning too, there's no defined term as to what low or moderate income is. If you had there's no affordability criterion in the bill. So there's not some requirement that you provide housing affordable to someone at 80% of AMI for 30% of their income. There's not that. It's kind of bounced back and forth and been rejected in the committees that I've been in, both on the Senate side and on the House side. But there is this purpose section which speaks to it. And what I would say is, if you had something like that, a 30% requirement, you would want to spell out what low to moderate income are, right? Because you need to know what that figure is. If you're just having a more general purpose section, you could boost the prescriptiveness of that section by defining what low or moderate income are. But I don't think you have to. You're basically spelling out to folks, you need to think about this consideration when you're creating these projects. But I will say, it is more, you could make it more prescriptive as to what they're meant to achieve. Right now, it relies on general concepts that people have as to what low to moderate income are.
But we've had those definitions in different parts of statute in the past.
Yes,
They're available to us.
exactly. And the concept that had been rejected for an affordability criterion was there's a Title 24 definition of affordable housing, which is for owner occupied, 30% of the income of someone at 120% of AMI. And then for renter, it's 80%, it's 30% of the income of someone at 80% of AMI. So those were the two figures for affordable housing. Lots of percentages.
Straightforward.
Yeah. You can think of the 30% as a guaranteed thing, right? Like we always think of 30% as how much should you be spending on housing? And then the percentage that's changing is based on whether it's owner occupied or renter. For owner, that definition in Title 24 it is 120%. And for the renter, it's 80%. So you have a lower affordability for renters.
Do members have questions on this yellow drafted language change? So, yeah. Go ahead.
Couple questions. One first statement, I'm not too crazy about the in perpetuity. I like the, what was it, 30-year?
Yeah, it's whatever the duration of the financing would be.
I'm trying to figure out, is with this whole chip program, is this trying to maintain whatever building or housing that's that's put in place because of the chip with the infrastructure? Is this to maintain long into the future that this would be strictly for low and moderate income? There would be no whatever, like some of the, what is it? There's another program to try to maintain housing so that when people sell,
Right.
they can only
Yes,
get the equity they put in. There's no,
right. We have things like the middle income out.
right. So this chip program is similar
It
to
is
that?
not like that. It is not like that. So and I'm going to scroll to the purpose because I think it's going to be helpful to think about this. In that context, and with the reminder that there is no specified affordability criterion built in. So what this is saying is encourage the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income. It does not say that that has to be all that you do within the development that you do.
Okay.
The idea is to create housing and we want to encourage as among that housing for those of lower moderate income. It is not prescriptive as to, doesn't have an outright affordability criterion that you have to meet. And it also doesn't say a specified percentage, which would have to be made available to households of lower moderate income. I think of this as the way you often think of intent or purpose sections, and it is a bit more substantive than intent sections in that it's pulled in a number of places throughout the bill where someone has to make a determination that you are doing this. But this is trying to get at what are the aims of the program and requiring folks to consider that. And actually, it might be helpful if I jump to where this is the case. In the, oh gosh, it's actually before. Okay.
Page are you on?
On page 4, section 1908 speaks to how a municipality creates a project and a housing development site. Among the things that it has to do is create a housing development plan. It has to create a financing plan. It has to create a map that describes the area where you're going to set the original taxable value. It has to do all of these things to set up this process. And so part of this is that housing development plan. And that would describe what the project is. It would describe what the housing is. It would talk about the financing terms. And one piece it would speak to is it would require a determination by the municipality that that proposed housing development furthers the purposes of the chapter. So that purpose section is built into the first stage of the process where the municipality is creating its housing development plan. But it is not I've calculated that 30% of this is going to go to folks within this income bracket. You need to make a determination that it is stimulating the development of housing for low to moderate income, but it's general. It is not specific, which is, I think, the discussion we're having. I would not say that it is like the programs I think that you were talking about, which mandate turnover to particular folks or have, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Based on income. Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going.
Yes. So the next piece we're coming to on page 6, just to orient, we're going to come to the request related to the location criterion, but we're talking about the project application. So the first thing the section we talked about, 1908, is the municipality setting up that project, creating a map, doing all of these things, going out to the public, getting input. The next piece is that they have to also get approval, and this is kind of the substantive constraints. They have to get approval from VEPC to use tax increment financing. If they've created the project, they've created the map, but they don't get the tax increment financing approval from VEPC, it's meaningless, right? There's nothing they can do. They just now have a map on the books, which is not functional. So under section 1910, what they do is they go to VEPC to receive approval for this tax increment financing, and there's sets of things the application has to meet. So you see at the bottom of page 6, VEPC may approve only applications that meet the process requirements, either of the project criteria and the location criterion. So you have to meet all of those steps. And then there's also this sunsetting piece, which we talked about last time. There's a deadline as to when you can last submit these applications, the end of 2035. I'm not going to belabor the process requirements at the top of page 7 unless folks want me to, but just know that this is a way of saying you need to have gone through the steps that are prescribed in the subchapter. The project criteria This does reflect the latest from House Commerce. So this is speaking to the housing element. It is not speaking to an affordability element, but it's speaking to housing. There's a two-prong, I say two-prong, there's really a first bucket you can follow into, and if that doesn't work out for you as a municipality, there's another option you can take. So under subdivision 1, VEPC would review the project application to determine whether at least 60% of the gross floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing, and they would also have to make a determination, VEPC would have to make this determination, that that proposed housing development furthers the purposes of section 1907. So note that I was recalling before, in the housing development plan, the municipality has to make that determination. But again, VEPC also has to make that determination independently. So two entities here have to make a determination that you're serving the purpose of the subchapter.
I had a question about, this came up when I was talking to Chair Marcotte about the 60% of gross floor area.
Yeah.
And we talked about it counting the attic and the basement, whether they were finished or not. What is the,
Yes, so
does include all that?
gross includes everything. The other way you could say this is net, net, which would be your usable area, or you could say usable floor area if you wanted a more restrictive. But the way to think about this is all your floor area. You're just going to look at the development itself. All the floor area is going to count. And you need to make sure that at least 60% of the floor area is used, which another way to think of this is that means you have a quite high threshold, right? If you were having to build in non-usable space, basically. So it is meaningful whether this is gross or net or usable, however you think about it. The gross will mean that the total 60% you have to give is a at least bigger floor area than if you just had the net, right? Because you have a greater floor area available under a gross floor area restriction, which picks up everything, versus the net, which is only going to pick up the usable space. But you could ask, like, which thing are you trying to get at, right? If people are providing 60% of the usable space to it, does it satisfy? But yes, it is a policy choice, and it is a meaningful difference whether you use.
Okay, so let's just talk that through for a little bit more, because the intent here is that housing be the primary investment that we're making.
Mhm.
So under which metric would, 60% on the face of it to me seems kind of low if the goal is housing. So which one will represent accurately?
So my natural response is that including gross floor area will mean that a larger percentage of your usable space is allotted to housing, because necessarily the non-usable spaces that are counted for gross floor area would contribute toward the percentage, right? Let's say it's 20% of the piece. So it's going to reduce among the usable space, you're going to have to allot a greater percentage of what you do. And maybe don't have something visible in front of me, but imagine that you're using gross floor area as your requirement, and 20% of it is non-usable space. So you have 80% available remaining, right? That is usable space. To get your 60% of the floor area dedicated to housing is 60% of the 100%, not 60% of the usable space, right? So I think of the 60% as being larger, right? Because are people following me? I feel like maybe I've lost. You have to draw all of your 60% from usable space, whereas, right, because the non-usable is counted toward your total, it's automatically going to be the 40%, right, that you're not meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
You see what
yeah, I do that.
I also might just pause because I don't think I'm helping, but yeah.
Representative Nor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering if these terms are defined somewhere, gross floor area and
Yeah.
housing, dedicated to housing. Does that mean does housing mean specifically living space? Like if I'm building a garage into my house, is that garage considered living space, even though I'm just gonna park my cars there, but it's counted toward gross, or is it not counted toward gross, or what?
So these are not defined terms, and I would say that the ultimate answer to this will be VEPC's read of the statute is going to be what is determinative here. And I would just note,
I'm not sure it's as involved as what you're saying. I mean, I think it's, what's the total square footage of this development? And is 60% of it going to housing? And that housing number is going to include the attics and basements.
you're saying that the attic is part of the housing and therefore satisfies the.
Yeah, I think it does. If it's part of the housing.
So it would depend,
Floors
right?
need to be defined.
Says gross floor.
It depends on what is,
And we can go.
I was envisioning, you're saying like a basement below a store. And I'm saying the basement is not going to be part of that. It's not housing. If what you're talking about is housing, then it counts toward house. So that is, and that is the question that you're raising is like, falls into that category. The numerical thing I was trying to draw out is that 60% of a larger area is a higher number than 60% of a smaller area. That's all that I was trying to say.
Got that.
But the question as to what is housing as drafted now would be a question for VEPSI as to analyze what contributes to that. And I would just note that you can definitely change this if you would like to, but the way, obviously we don't use this concept for TIF districts, but much of the way that TIF has worked on the books is through VEPSI rulemaking. And I would just note that we do authorize VEPSI to undertake rulemaking to build out this program. But if you would like to tighten or be specific, I mean, the danger you always have if you start going into this category is being overly like decreasing the flexibility that you have with it. But it is a meaningful question here as to what.
I think just the question for the committees who are looking at this is what is meaningful housing ratio on a project that we're looking supposedly to create housing when, I mean, and maybe a moot point, we have a lot of empty retail space in the world. And maybe all of these projects will be 100% housing, but I don't know. I just wonder why 60% seems low to me. Representative Chapin, do you have? I thought you were raising. your hand.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide
Couldn't
where
tell.
I am. I guess I would just
Logan
say,
might be ready.
having spent some time working at Vermont Housing Conservation Board and seeing lots of multi-use projects get funded with state dollars, I would just say, this isn't really relevant for places that have like one house garages. It's going to be relevant for multi-use commercial and housing. So more relevant would be like, how do you count a parking garage? So I would just say that I think, your standard multi-use spaces usually have first floor commercial, maybe a parking garage, and then upstairs housing. And I think, this is sort of driving, more than half of that space being used, that the majority of the used everyday space be towards housing rather than commercial. And it feels like it roughly fits what we see as multi-use housing development.
I'm not sure you're not making a lot of assumptions about the type of project. This, maybe if we're able to limit it to, growth areas, it'll be more dense development like you're describing. I'm not sure that this bill limits it that way at all.
I'm not saying it limits it. I'm just saying, I think I don't know, I hear that the flexibility is useful and that there's just, when there's so many different potential projects, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But when you think of the multi-use kind of project, I think 60% seems like a reasonable place that bends towards the majority of the space is going to be used for housing.
Representative Logan.
That answered my question, actually. Well, except that how is parking space being counted?
So that I was going to say, this poses another question, which is if we talked last time about geographic separation, you can have geographic separation, but between the infrastructural improvement where that is installed and the housing development site, right? The housing development site is about the housing development. So if you're doing sewage or water lines, that might be off the parcel on which the housing development is occurring. But theoretically, another kind of improvement that you could pursue is a parking garage for that specific housing development. And it could be an in-ground garage for a rising development, right? You could do something like that. This was something that came up in committee yesterday, and we talked about whether, again, I have the same unhappy answer I had to your question before, as to it's kind of at VEPSI's discretion as to how this is being resolved. I think it would be natural to say, because that's an infrastructural improvement, it is not part of the housing. And so the restriction of the 60% is about not the garage that you're installing for it, but the actual building itself. Is the garage a building, which is what's picked up in the housing development definition. But agreed that this is not something that is resolved. And I think it does affect this threshold question of the 60%.
Let's get to our location.
Yep. So I can come back to 2, but just to note that 2 is another prong for achieving housing under a board determination. So the new language proposed here is on page 8, subsection E on line 6. This is replacing the proposal that the that you guys have seen related to a more expansive set of location criteria to just be VEPC shall review a municipality's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the housing development site, so where the housing development is occurring, is located within an area designated Tier 1A or Tier 1B, or an area falling within the interim housing exceptions. So a more restrictive category than you've seen in both the Senate proposal and what you've been hearing from the House Commerce piece. And if it's helpful for me to speak to where Commerce landed, I can do that. So it's,
You provided us that language, but
Yes.
are we finished with the changes that reflect?
Yes.
Our
yes,
request?
yes.
Okay, I thought that, and the multiple places in the bill where the location was called out are the criterions that you've highlighted. Okay, great. Let's look at, we can.
You want me to pull up there?
Sure.
Yeah.
I also want to make sure we have time to get to the part that, Kate's amendment that Ellen's here for.
Okay, so I'll try to go pretty quickly through their draft just to call out the changes they made. So what you see highlighted here is not highlighted against your draft, right? This is highlighted against what was received from the Senate. The substantive change you see at the bottom of this first page for the definition of housing development is to pick up rehabilitation or renovation that had initially spoken to just new construction. This is saying, well, if you can create habitable buildings, that's possible. Very similar change to the definition of improvements on page 2, just to add rehabilitation of infrastructure. If you have dilapidated infrastructure in place, you could fix that. And then this is not a substantive change on line 14. This is the indicative list of things that count as infrastructure, but noted is not exhaustive. They didn't like the word transportation because it sounds theoretically like cars and buses and the like. So they changed to roads, bridges, sidewalks, but it's not really a substantive change. It is just an indicative list of permissible kinds of infrastructure. We can jump to, we've already spoken on page 5 about this new highlighted language, which is, this is talking about the housing development plan and how the municipality has to make a determination that the housing development furthers the purposes of the subchapter. And you can see their version on page 6 of the terms related to primary residence. This is the time limited version of what has been proposed in here. So same lead in, provide terms to insure, offered exclusively as a primary residence, but they have until all indebtedness for that project incurred during the debt incursion period is retired. So, you know, theoretically up to like a 30-year type period, but it could be shorter. It's until all debt is retired. So it would depend on the terms of the financing.
And in past TIFs, how long has the financing gone for?
I think 2030 is fairly typical. I wouldn't be the best position, but what I hear is 2030 is common. And if you think about,
20 to 30 years?
yeah,
Trying to-
exactly. And if you think about the retention period is commonly 20 years, and you often still have debt outstanding at the point that your retention expires. So I think you're talking about a relatively long-term, but not on the grand scheme of things, right? Like and the theoretical thinking behind folks just not wanting like folks wanting a more limited period, is that it ties the restriction to the period for which the municipality is receiving an explicit benefit from the program, right? Basically, once this is expired, we're kind of out of the CHIP program is the thinking, but there's nothing to say that you have to do it that way. That was just part of what was offered in House Commerce as a potential justification. So same concept as you guys, but time limited. And if you wanted more insight on the financing, it would probably be, we could look at like a VEPC report to see what the financing terms are. And something worth mentioning here, which we haven't really talked about, is that for TIF districts, and maybe we'll see something very different for CHIP, but for TIF districts, folks are often asking for extensions of their debt incursion period. So when I say 20, 30 years, we're talking about the terms of one line of financing, but let's say you got an extension and you issued debt 8 years after you started the project and its financing doesn't end until 30 years later, then you've got 38 years, right? So if folks are getting extensions, that restriction can become longer, and it's not something I'd really thought about. It means that if a municipality wants to extend its debt incursion period or issue later terms of financing, it does extend the primary residence restriction. So creates a sort of interesting, incentive. Clean up changes on page 7 just to pick up some of the language that we talked about, making sure I'm not saying a or any when we're talking about two criteria. On page 8, we've just talked about the first prong of the project criteria, so subdivision 1, but I'll quickly hit subdivision 2. If you can't meet what happened, the project criterion in subdivision 1, so that's 60% plus VEPC determination that you're serving the purposes of the subchapter, there's an alternative route available to you. So if VEPC determines that your application would otherwise get through, meaning you meet the process requirements, you meet the location requirements, but you just don't meet that subdivision 1, they will reach out to the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board, which is at the very end of this bill, to determine whether the projected housing development meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community, and the board makes a determination, and their affirmative determination is an alternative route for a project to get through. It doesn't meet these particular pieces. And I think we talked about this some last time in here. Okay, the location criteria, which is what you guys are going to be most interested in. This is on pages 8 and 9. I'm going to skip the highlighted text on 9 and come back to it just so you can see the buckets they have at the start. They have Tier 1A or Tier 1B plus interim housing exemptions, which is what has been proposed in the draft in here, or an existing settlement or area within 1/2 mile. But more significantly is this highlighted language. So this is basically a way of kicking folks out of any location criteria. This proviso says that a housing development for which all permits required pursuant to 10 VSA Chapter 151 have been secured as of the time of application shall be deemed to have satisfied the location criteria of this subsection. Meaning, if you came at the time of your TIF application with all of your permits in hand, you do not have to fall in any particular area and you could be anywhere in the state. That is what this language is. The rationale offered is folks are, as you'll know, at the end of this bill, they integrate as a third location criteria Tier 2. And the folks who are pushing for Tier 2 and wanting a quicker rollout of when that arrives are saying, well, what if someone's ready today? Like, why restrict them? This is language that attempts to say, if you're ready today, you can build. But it is effectively, as I tried to stress to the committees, it is effectively saying you don't have location criteria is what it means. And even in the future, because this language would remain, it's not pulled out at the point that they roll in Tier 2, it means that someone can just come with Act 250 permits in hand and they go anywhere.
Meet the Representative Chapin.
Okay. My understanding from the auditor and others is that one of the biggest concerns that the public has with TIF financing is that it has been used in places where the development would have occurred anyway. And so the education fund is losing a whole lot of money, and the public is losing a whole lot of money to developers' pockets. That's my understanding of where TIF goes wrong. So when I look at this, it says if I have all my permits in place as a developer, I don't get there if the money doesn't pencil out for the project. So what on earth in our statutes is stopping us from approving these by VEPC when they would otherwise happen if we're getting rid of stuff like location criteria because somebody has all their permits already?
There is, don't want to be incredibly strong on this. So I'll try to be more diplomatic. In TIF districts, we have a but-for test, which is a requirement that you evaluate a project to say, this wouldn't have happened but for the use of tax increment financing. There is no but-for test for this program. You don't have to make a determination that these projects couldn't proceed without tax increment financing. It is technically permissible under this program to be providing an incentive to projects that otherwise would have worked. The rationale that folks have stated, because that is just a theoretical point, right, about what the statute limits, is that folks have said, and why they've been, this is my characterization of why folks are offering the proposal, is that the housing isn't getting built. So what they're saying is you don't need a but-for test because it's not happening. We know that the housing isn't happening, and therefore, why have that restriction? The other thing I would offer too is that TIF districts, and I'm just stating what folks have said. This is not my position. This is not, this is just what has been said in the room. There's no but-for test here. The other thing is TIF districts have an aggregate check, right? There's a limit to how many districts you can have in the state. There's a limit to how many you can have in counties. There is no aggregate check on this program. Theoretically, you could have hundreds and thousands. I mean, there's going to be a practical constraint, but there's no numerical constraint on the projects that can happen under this program. So I take your question to be about ed fund impacts, and I think those are the most responsive things I can say. And you will want, you will Ted Barnett to come in and speak to those. I'm not trying to make him do a bunch of work, but it would be helpful for him to speak to those pieces because they're outside my.
Certainly can't, not sure. There's a lot of issues with that. I certainly can't support this particular language, given that.
I would just say that this specific language, like my response had nothing to do with this proviso, right? It's just about constraints broadly and related to the ed fund. This language does make available no location criteria. And in fact, I suggested if you're just going to make the whole state available, why do you have location? Like, what is the point of location criteria if you make?
And I'll just take a moment to make my pitch, which is that the committing to 1A and 1B and in the interim exemption areas supports our statutory vision and commitment to smart growth principles, and also provides that boundary, fiscal boundary, if you will, around the areas available for this type of public investment, which from where I sit, most logically should be supporting our larger vision of smart growth. Representative,
To the point you were trying to make about the possibility of it would be unlimited growth.
Mhm.
There is a provision in here for suitable soils as being one of the criteria to be able to put in some sort of development, correct?
I know nothing about that.
if, to be a 1B, yes,
Suitable soils.
yeah.
So it's not as if in this entire state, we have suitable soils everywhere. So
Well,
that could be a limiting factor.
I mean,
correct?
Well, to the extent that that's a bigger thing. So like to the extent that, you can build on, like in Middlebury, we have a lot of clay, but we have a municipal wastewater treatment plant. So we're not dependent upon perk tests in our sewer treatment area. So that's a kind of a different issue that I'm hearing you talk about. But if you're talking about where you're going to make these investments in like a 1B, yes, you could have water, sewer, or suitable soils. So it's, I think for this committee, we should focus on our work in land use and our commitment to the statutory goal and vision for the state of Vermont. That's what I would encourage for us to not get too far in the weeds on some of the other topics. Ellen, did you want to add something?
Ellen Jacobs, New York Solar Legislative Council. I'm just going to clarify that that's not in CHIP. That's just an Act 252 Tier 1B requirement, and that isn't even necessary for this proposal from Commerce. So this is opening it up to the whole state, the yellow language.
Yeah. And I want to actually, though, in the amendment that you drafted for us,
Yes.
it removes, because you said, and then later on, they talk about tier 2, which is Commerce keeping tier 2 in, but I'm asking us to remove it.
Yep, I don't have tier 2 and you guys they have a future effective addition of tier 2, January 1, 2028.
Is that the next thing?
So yeah, I can scroll pretty quickly through the remainder. Some technical provisions on page 14. I don't think I need to go through it, but I will speak to the increments themselves. They dropped it. The Senate said 80% of your education increment and not less than 100% of your municipal property tax increment. This uses the percentages that are in place for TIF districts. So 70% for the statewide education property tax increment and 85, not less than 85 of the municipal property tax increment. And did include an adjustment of percentage measure. This is something that's in place for TIF districts to allow VEPSI to look at a 10-year mark and say, do you still need as high a percentage as this? Can we downward amend? So this is an effort toward protecting the ed fund. And it uses the same mechanics as we use for TIF districts. Some new reporting provisions. I'm on page 17 for expected or actual sale and rental prices and the number of housing units known to be occupied other than as a primary residence. A 5-year check-in to see if folks are encountering barriers in accessing the program and having VEPSI provide recommendations to see if there's ways to fix those. And then the actual piece that you were just asking about at the very end of the bill. We have our board stood up and location criteria, page 22. Section 21A, this is a future effective location criteria. And what it does, as you see on 23, is add area designated tier 2, and then you see that effective date to take effect on January 1, 2028. So expanding the location criteria, and I would just note, they don't at that time remove the proviso that we just talked about, that Act 250 permits in hand. So you could still come in with Act 250 permits in hand and build, although I don't know. You could be building.
The two, the whole state. That's interesting. Well, anyway,
Can I ask you a question?
you may.
Sorry, in the reporting section.
Yes,
It says, number of housing units, that have an Act 250 permit.
there is a piece there related to, yes.
Yeah, so just so you know, most of the housing constructed will be exempt from Act 250 unless they're, so tier 1A and tier 1B and the interim exemptions, those will all be exempt from Act 250, so they won't be captured.
Yep, and I think that the folks administering this program would be happy not to,
To count,
yes.
okay.
But if you did, it could be a renovation of existing development, like, because this committee, Economic Development Committee, has added in investments in existing housing. But
Sure, and then the areas outside.
so, okay, what I would like to do is give Kate a moment. John, so you've gone through our amendment and their amendments.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Further questions for John before we shift gears?
Just a clarification on the top of page 9, where it talked about coming in with permits in hand.
Yes,
When it says all permits, that means Act 250 permits,
Well, everything.
it's those required pursuant to 10 VSA, chapter 151, so.
which would include Act 250 permits.
But
Yeah, which
not, it wouldn't be your A and R permits. It's really activity.
It's not, that's what I was trying to get.
No, I
Does
don't
it
think so. I
include
think it-
Water and wastewater.
But
and
do
all?
you need all
That's
of those
all
permits in
permits.
order to get your Act 250 permit?
I'm sorry, but doesn't it limit it to that section of statute?
Yes, so it's just Act 250 permits.
Just Act 250 permit, but Act 250 is an umbrella, which includes getting your stormwater and your.
Yeah.
It's true. You're right.
Yeah.
Right. Functionally, it would be that.
So that immediately limits you to very few select areas within the state where you can actually get an Act 250 permit because you gotta meet all those requirements. I mean, so.
No, 98% of Act 250 permits are issued. They're all over the state. There's a great map of them. They're everywhere, Act 250 permits.
Yeah, they're everywhere, but not anywhere. I guess is my point. I mean, they're selected from all counties, correct? But, you know,
But-
you can't be like.
But this is new development.
Or-
This is new development that has their permits. This isn't, and this is a new development program, not an existing development program. Like it's.
I know. But I'm trying to reconcile the 2 points that were made, with one which is in words, which says all permits in hand, all, I think being all, everything related to Act 250, what I'm understanding.
Yeah.
And then the other statement being, well, now you can build anywhere. Well, you can only build in places where you can actually get an Act 250 permit to build, which is pretty limiting.
98% of the state.
It's not
It's
limiting.
not limiting.
But they have to meet the criteria.
You have to meet,
Why are we in a housing crisis if it's not limiting?
because it's not the problem, it's not the cause of the housing crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
Yes.
All right, it is noon. Ellen, I'm wondering, are you available after the floor today?
Yes, can I add one other slide? Because I didn't go to commerce. I just want to flag that, should this proposal about all of an act, having your Act 250 permit done doesn't mean you have the location requirement. If the infrastructure being constructed is wastewater or water supply, that then potentially means that they're gonna have to get an Act 250 permit amendment to what they've already gotten. So I was wondering if they got, I didn't have any, I wasn't there. I don't know what kind of testimony they got on this requirement, but it feels like there's a practical issue there about chicken and the egg.
Yeah, could be.
Now, it obviously, there's lots of other kinds of infrastructure that could be built under this program that wouldn't necessitate an amendment to the Act 250 permit, but if they get their Act 250 permit, they're bound by the requirements in it, and so like, if they then are gonna be adding additional infrastructure, they're gonna need to probably amend their
Our
permit.
permits, this is great. Hopefully the Commerce Committee, if they pursue this amendment, will have you in. I'm thinking, I'm not gonna recommend we pursue this amendment. Representative Sackler.
Yeah, this, I guess, isn't really so much our part of the bill, but I am really concerned that that we'd be putting in public money for projects that wouldn't happen, that would have happened anyway. And in particular, projects that have their permits now, like were presumably designed and, and thought through budget wise, that they weren't going to be using this program. So it seems like doubly sort of wrong to be saying that if a project has all their permits now, that we would be automatically making them, available, that we make this program available to them.
Yeah. And can I add, it also seems like an avenue for corruption. Because if this, at the end of your permitting process, you have the potential to get TIF financing for your project, then that I can imagine the kind of like maneuvering that would happen in order to get that financing up front as you're like developing the project and trying to pencil the budget out in the first place. It just seems messy. It's messy.
All right, members, we will come back 10 minutes after the floor with Ellen talking about this